Great. Terrific. Well, why don't we get started and we'll get going. Hey there, everyone. I'm Eric Becker, Digital Director, Senior Editor at Words Without Borders. And I'm delighted to welcome you to our event with Parul Sehgal and Adam Dalva, where they will discuss recent trends in international literature, Sehgal's journey as a writer and critic, and what it means to establish a vocabulary of pleasure. We're thrilled to host Parul as part of our ongoing digital conversation series, engaging leading thinkers in conversations on writing around the world. A few quick details before we get started. And my colleague Anna will post all this information in the chat as I go. And you can feel free to message her directly if you have any questions, comments, or concerns about Zoom specifically. A note that we will be recording this event and publishing this conversation on our website next week, so you can revisit it there. We will also be muting everyone except for our participants to ensure that we can hear Parul and Adam today. But just because we're all on mute doesn't mean you can't offer your reactions to what you'll hear. Please use the chat window at right to do so and to ask any questions you'd like to have answered during the Q&A that will follow. We will have closed captioning available during this event. To turn it on, just click the arrow next to CC on your bottom toolbar and select Show Subtitles. You'll also notice on the top right of the Zoom application window, you have the option to toggle between a gallery view and speaker view. We suggest speaker view so that you can see Parul and Adam at all times. And finally, a suggestion to sign up for our newsletter, which is the best way to keep up with all the excitement going on at WWB. Now for some quick introductions. Parul Sehgal is a staff writer at The New Yorker. Previously, she was a book critic at The New York Times, where she also worked as a senior editor and columnist. She has won awards for her criticism from the New York Press Club, the National Book Critics Circle, and the Robert B. Silvers Foundation. She teaches in the Graduate Creative Writing Program at New York University. Adam Dalva's writing has appeared in The New Yorker, the Paris Review, The Atlantic, and the New York Review of Books. He is books editor for Words Without Borders and senior fiction editor of Guernica magazine. Adam serves on the board of the National Book Critics Circle and is an assistant professor of creative writing at Rutgers University. And with that, Adam, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you so much, Eric. And thank you, Parul. This is a deep honor for me. I've been a fan of your criticism for many years, and it's such a treat to get to talk to you today.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
So the structure of today, we're going to talk a bit about translated literature, since we're Words Without Borders, and also about your own journey and practices as a critic. And in about 35 minutes, I'll take some audience questions. So, as we heard, do put questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat, and any questions you have for Parul, we'll get to then. So I think a bit about you first before we talk about Words Without Borders and translated criticism. I read an interview with you where you described books as a controlled substance in your childhood home, a quote I loved. So I do wonder, what was your path toward criticism, and what was sort of this controlled substance of a book that obviously enticed you from a young age?
What was it? Yeah, my parents were incredibly strict, and fiction was just seen as this thing that my family had a lot of in the house, and fiction of an especially delicious, corrupting kind. It was like a lot of André Gide. It was like the good stuff they had, and my mother, quite rightfully, was just like, this will ruin your life. Stay away from this. Do not go into the study. You need to work. And so naturally, we were always in the study, and all we wanted were those books and were those stories. So I think for me, reading was always, and remains, despite my profession, something that feels very, very private. It feels very illicit. It feels, there's no sense of obligation about it. I think for me, there's no, it was always something that I'm so sorry, that one is, you're kind of getting away with, and it takes you to places that you shouldn't necessarily go. It's full of transgression, and it is not school. And I think that that's something, when I think about the kind of criticism I like to read and I like to write, and the criticism that I kind of grew up reading, because I discovered that genre very early on, and it was this it was this alternative to the way that I found books spoken about and discussed in other places. You know, there was something conspiratorial about criticism. There was something full of gossip. There was something full of all the stories around the novel and why it matters. And all of that to me felt and continues to feel very exciting. So, yeah, and I think I mean, I think I've said this before, like I still read like somebody's going to catch me reading. Like it's always like in the strange hours, it's always furtive, it's always so it's stayed that way. I mean, it was like it was a strange sort of gift to you know, have books held and treated with this heavy degree of suspicion, I think.
And then criticism, if books are your private, you know, affair, essentially must feel like a kind of conspiracy you're sharing with someone. I love what you wrote a couple of years ago, that the critic is saying, come sit next to me, you know, come read with me. I wonder, are there critics when you were growing up or now who you like to sit next to when you read, who you feel are particularly influential on your own practices?
Yeah, I mean, all these people.
Oh, wow, that's a good.
It's all these, yeah, it's still a kind of friendship, a kind of truth telling, a kind of gift, an expansion in vocabularies I possess and have for not only books, but for my own forms of pleasure, delight, terror. There's something about that voice, and it's not even just book criticism, but when you look over the work and you look towards the reader or the viewer and you address them, and that encounter, and sometimes the work is just the excuse for that encounter, you know, in the same way that like in I'm sure we've all read reviews where we're kind of like, my friend, you have forgotten the book you're reviewing, but wherever we are, wherever this is taking you is so exciting and so rich. There's something about that space that feels very, very charged to me. I mean, when it comes to specific critics, there's so many and they're constantly changing, but you know, I do have certain touchstones and people I return to. But yeah, I think it's just it feels like there's some real generosity, I think, in the best kinds of criticism, and a real kind of vulnerability, and I think a real kind of performance. You know, I think really good criticism for me has all the elements of great stand-up, of any kind of show. It is a show, but it's a show about of really, really deep and deranging kinds of thought and feeling. And I think for me also, which I think is somewhat significant, having come up, you know, reading criticism and writing criticism in newspapers, that you're getting away with this very odd encounter in the space of a newspaper also felt very, just that feeling, that frisson of getting away with something, of doing something a little bit odd and eccentric and curious in the context of this, you know, staid place.
I love how many sensual words we're already using as we describe.
It's a good.
It's good.
I mean, I'm glad to hear it. And I apologize. I'm so grateful, first of all, to everybody who's here. Thank you. If you're on your lunch break, if you're my father, at 2:00 in the morning in Singapore, you know, it's so nice to see everybody. But I am very bleary. I think the other thing about doing any kind of criticism or writing is, I was thinking about this morning and I was like, I'm excited to speak to Adam. And I was like, I haven't slept in like a bunch of days. I'm wrestling with this piece. You're kind of living as a college student forever. I was like, how is this what I've chosen to do? So I am bleary, but I'm glad it's coming across as sensuous bleariness.
As someone who's on his own deadline,
I know.
I very much understand.
An odd thing to do.
It's very strange. And it is a permanent, but you know, in school and academics, I feel like thought is something that we try to be the biggest thinker we can in an academic essay, whereas with criticism, and I think you are amazing at this, it's instead sort of a performance of thought, to sort of to take a reader along the thinking you're having with the book, and not obviously having done a ton of research, having done a ton of supplemental reading, but it feels very organic when I read you. And of course that must be a crafted thing you've learned to do. So how does one not write academic criticism and instead write a more sort of practical, here are my thoughts sort of style
Oh
writing?
God, I don't know. Do you know? I don't know.
No, I was
feel
hoping
like
you'd tell me. That's why I asked. I don't ask questions I know the answers to.
I know. I feel like this is a very unfair thing for a critic to say, but it's just like, do we know how we do what we do? I mean, I review people's books as if they do, but there is something mysterious. I think it's a matter of like having done this kind of writing for a while, and I think being edited by wonderful people who've helped me shape that. And I think predominantly just wanting to write something that I'm not bored by. You know,
Mm.
I'm my first reader. We're all our first readers, right? So we're overhearing ourselves. Like, I don't want to read anything tedious and overly academic. I want to write something that might give me pleasure. And I'm a fairly prickly, grumpy reader. So that's the first thing, you know, but I do think that there's like a great discipline in writing for a lot of the places that you and I write for, you know, whether it's the Times or the New York Review, the New Yorker, where you're trying to speak to lots of different kinds of people, you know, and you want something that isn't going to embarrass you around people who really know what you're writing about, but you want to be inviting and you want to create a space for thinking and for people who have other kinds of intelligence to come and meet the topic. And I think it's partly, you know, I'm sure it has something to do with the fact that, you know, I come from a family where some people are readers, but, you know, my grandmothers were illiterate and didn't read, didn't know how to read, you know, and yet were brilliant, intelligent, interesting people. And you could talk about any number of books with them, right? So I think that there is that feeling of just of wanting to bring books and wanting to bring this kind of conversation to people that, you know, to create openings, you know, and just like the kinds of conversations that you can have when you are thinking about so many different kinds of readers can create also a piece. Not always, but it can be kind of wily and it can be kind of, I just think it can be kind of more unexpected. And I think it can force you to think about your premises sometimes when you're not writing something overly academic that is, you know, whose subtext is, let me teach you, you know, if your subtext is something different, you know, you can kind of go into more interesting places. Sometimes we write, sometimes we type, but that's the aim.
That's very good. I'll write that down.
Yeah.
So, you know, you mentioned these fabulous places you've written for, and one thing I've been interested in as a reader of you is following you from the Times to the New Yorker, where most of your pieces for the Times were 1,000 words, beautiful. You have so many. I mean, I wrote down paragraphs of your openings are incredible, and if we had time, I'd love to ask how you write a good opening because you're terrific at it. But now you have space, and you know, I started out, and I know you also edited for Publishers Weekly. So my beginning was a 240-word anonymous column, which was like opinion, fact, opinion, and now you had
240. I had 220.
They gave me 240. Yes,
Oh,
I got promoted. And once they offered me $50 instead of 25. And then you had the Times, and now you have these New Yorker essays, which are so capacious. I wrote down, read your narrative essay. You're in 3 paragraphs, Prince Harry, Laurie Moore, Annie Ernaux, Clint Smith, Yusuf Komunyakaa. You know, so we're following your brain through this incredibly diverse and disparate group of writers. So what is it like to have all this space in your writing now, and what does that allow you to do or not do?
It's horrifying. I think that the years of working in small places, you know, I like compression, I like brevity, and I think, you know, writing for the Times and writing those reviews, you can, you know, you have to pirouette a fair amount, you know, and you can gesture at thought, and you can say things, well, of course, as everybody knows. And I remember getting to the New Yorker and my editor just putting his thumb down on one of those little moves, just being like, do you know what you mean? Do we know what you mean? And then just being like, oh shit, now I need to actually think this stuff through. No, it's great. I think that there's a really, it's one of the reasons I think why I wanted to make that shift, you know, and to move and to learn how to think in these wider spaces, at the same time cognizant of the fact that people's stamina when it comes to reading is decreasing every minute, my own included, right? So how do you still write those pieces that can hold people wrapped, you know, sentence to sentence, clause to clause, stretching, and at the same time using that space to have a different kind of experience for the reader and then also for myself. So that's the work, you know, and trying to understand not just how I think in that space, but how people who would read me are also moving and with their own sense of expectations, and how do you play with that? You know, it's a time we spend together. So how do we make something that is not just dull tedium, me standing at a chalkboard saying, look at this paragraph, let us admire it together. You know, this is not what we want to do.
Sometimes a critic will file reviews where it will just say, look at this, and then there'll be this, and then they'll keep
sometimes
going.
only
Yeah.
exclusively. Then you come in and you're just like, oh no. I mean, but there's also value to certain kinds of more pedagogic forms of criticism. I certainly derive a lot of, you know, pleasure. I just think that it's not my mother tongue, you know. I think it's not, you know, when I think about, when you ask me who do I love to read, and I think about James Schuyler and Wayne Kostenbaum and
Yes, oh my gosh.
You know, like that's the stuff, Bart's, like that's that stuff that is just Margot Jefferson. It's exhilarating, you know, it's really and all these are writers who play and think a lot about performance and about, you know, criticism as a form of play, almost as a form of touch, even when you read Wayne, you know?
Oh yes. And Margot Jefferson, reach through the page.
That's right. That's right. Can I ask who you love to read, critic-wise?
I love Margot Jefferson. I've been reading a lot of Elizabeth Hardwick lately. I've really liked the new Washington Post book section. I think is putting out like terrific stuff, and
I
I've
agree.
been reading all of them. And a few of our critics that we've had in for Words Without Borders, like Hannah Weber is a terrific critic. Alison Bulger is a terrific critic. So yeah, but wide range. And my God, we could go on forever. We could go on forever. But you know, on the subject of attention span, and we've been talking about delights so far, and I love a delight. I'm not as interested in what it is to write a negative review or a pan, but I am interested in how you read. I always love hearing about critics' readings practices. One thing I was wondering is how do you read with our modern attention span? If you're 40 pages into a book you've agreed to review, and you're kind of getting the oh no, I don't think I like this. I don't think it would sustain my attention if I was reading it as a civilian. You know, what does one do, or what do you do to fight through that?
Small rewards.
Small rewards.
I bribe myself across.
We love an example here at Words Without Borders.
No, I mean, I feel like, no, it's oh, that's such a bad feeling, isn't it? It's such a bad feeling. And it's especially bad if a book is not good in a dull way. If a book is not good in an interesting, odd, brazen way, that's fantastic, you know? And that again sort of will double back and be like, but why am I? What's happening to me as I'm reading? You know, what is the occasion for this? But when you're reading something that is just bad in a predictable, lazy way, yeah, that's when you just like, some stamina has to kick in. No, it's just like a lot of kicking and screaming and, you know, lining up candy in the margins of the book and all kinds of things.
That's a good idea. And are you a quick reader? Or are these things that you're flying through? Are you, what is
I'm a very fast reader. I mean, that's one thing I think that helps. I mean, most of my life hinders these things, but I think a pretty a quick reader, because I do reread, you know, you do want as much time as I have to read the book as many times as I can. That feels very important. You know, you only notice things, or at least I only notice things the second and third time. You know, you can only see the weave, you can only see a lot of it, especially with novels, right? Especially with novels. So that kind of patterning you want to have time for and space. But yeah, no, I think to protect the stamina, to protect anybody's form of attention is something that we're all heavily involved in. So
I think we share that we're both interested. When I'm reviewing a novel, no matter how long, I try to read it in one sitting at first to try to see what it's like as a durational experience before, you know, and I know you do that too.
I mean, I do it because I'm just fundamentally like afflicted with inertia. Whatever I'm doing, I tend to keep doing. So if I'm in a novel, I will just continue reading the novel. If I'm avoiding the novel, I will keep avoiding the novel. But that's interesting for you. That's a practice. Like you'll sit and you'll make sure you
I
have the
try.
whole thing in your head.
Not
I think
always.
that's very helpful. Yeah. No, I think
So,
that.
I want to ask a bit about international
Let's do
literature.
it.
You know, as I was reading your work, both
Mm.
older and newer, there are some moments that I was really struck by about translation, and maybe starting our conversation about international literature by thinking about translation. I was thinking first of a wonderful moment in you're writing about exophonic writers who write in a language other than their native language, where you write a paragraph in Hindi and then translate it after the fact, and you only reveal that after the fact. So you've sort of
Humiliating.
translated
Mm.
yourself.
Mm.
Humiliating. So I loved it. What was humiliating? So I would love to hear about that first. That was, I thought, one of the most interesting critical gambits I've seen.
Well, thank you. I mean, I was writing about, I'm trying to, was it Leonora Carrington was the occasion for the essay, I think.
Carrington.
Right. And she wrote in a different language and then translated it. And I was writing about all of these writers that move out of their mother tongue for very complicated, interesting reasons, whether it's people like Jhumpa Lahiri, et cetera, Yoon Lee. And I suddenly wanted that experience. And I grew up speaking, you know, a tangle of Hindi and English together, but I'd never written in Hindi. And I'd never translated. I'd never done it, even though I would, you know, my reading diet is pretty heavy on translation. And yeah, it was just like, I felt like I was in the dark. I felt like I was crashing around. I felt very, very, yeah, it was a very alienating and interesting experience, but one that felt important to try to have when you're describing what it means to leave certain tools and certain kinds of faculties and way of knowing yourself behind.
And what about the challenges or benefits of reviewing translated literature? I'm thinking about, you took on in a recent essay a translation, "The young woman on the stretcher moves slightly," and you wrote a more faithful translation would be something like, "There was a movement in Sakina's corpse." So you have in a way, when I think we review translated literature, we have an extra tool that we can use, but it also, of course, creates obstacles. So what is your practice and approach with translated lit?
Well, in the case that you mentioned, I was fortunate because I was talking about a translation of the great partition writer Manto,
Right.
who's written some of the most savage, pained novels and stories about that atrocity and about the deaths that he saw. And part of how Manto has come to us, as I write in the piece, is a bit tricky, because you do see some of his translators, while they are, you know, exhilarated to tell us like, oh, this is Manto, he flinches from nothing, they are taming him in the sentences. And I can only do that because that's a language that I have some knowledge of, right? I know Hindi and Urdu not so well, but enough to say, that's strange, you've changed that, you softened that. Manto is not calling Sakina a woman in that moment. Manto is calling her a corpse. Right? And so Manto, who wrote so beautifully and eloquently about what it means to be the living dead, to come through partition and the kind of posthumous life you lead after seeing these atrocities, is very pointed in that choice of word. So in some instances, when I can see that happening, I can speak with some kind of authority, right? In other things that I have reviewed, whether it's Machado de Assis, or if it's, I think there's like I wrote about a couple of translations of Chekhov. I don't have Russian in that way. I don't have Portuguese in that way, but I can still bring together other translations and try to think about what it means when you see these different kinds of choices. So I think reading in translation, and specifically reading multiple translations of a particular work, is something that I've always done, in particular because it's taught me how to read. And it's taught me, especially when it comes to fiction, the kinds of choices that are happening. And I'm writing right now about this critic who has this terrific phrase about translation, that it's a re-rendering, that she keeps saying, of the word, right? Yeah. So, and it's like, that's the thing, like, what is the world being rendered? What are the creative possibilities that the translator is seeing in that moment? And I do also think that it's perhaps useful in this, or not useful, but the notion of reading in translation as something being apart from regular reading feels to me something very new. You know, for most of the world, and I lived most of my life, I think, outside of America, right? And I think especially when I was living in India in the early aughts, there was a kind of reading when you're not living in the so-called center that is just, I mean, everybody was just reading everything. We were reading Japanese literature, we were reading Russian literature, we were reading, it was just that feeling of the best of everything, you know? This doesn't tie into our point at all, just to say that sometimes I do feel the way that it's been siloed and can be siloed. It's just, it's a frustrating thing because it makes you realize how we're not doing nearly enough of it. And I had this feeling. I was one of the judges for the Man Booker International Prize this year. And so we read 136, I think 137 novels translated into the English. And I just felt furious. I felt so angry that I was coming to so many of these writers so late, you know?
Yeah.
That I had not, I was just like, how is it that I'm, you know, in my 40s and I'm just discovering this incredible writer who's on her 6th, 7th, 8th book, you know? And so there is that feeling of just, of being bereft. And I'm somebody who essentially is always just, you know, mulling over some fiction or the other. And it was sort of this feeling of like, our fiction writers also need access to these writers because there are things happening in technique. There are things happening in the novel that to me felt so fresh, you know. It felt so like it could irrigate everything that's happening here if there was more exposure and more interest and more availability, you know. And my small rant is over. I mean, I was preaching to the choir here.
No, you're right. Yeah,
I don't think anybody here is going to disagree, but I was very struck by that feeling of just feeling like this theft. I cannot believe coming to so many of these people so late in the day.
I was thinking about your, I thought, fabulous essay on the trauma plot, which you wrote for the New Yorker, and how it's, you know, you write of it as being sort of a creep in contemporary literature, and I often find that in my reading of international literature, both for Words Without Borders, and as you say, we should just be reading everything and be balanced, and we're never going to find everything, but we must sort of feel compelled to try. You know, are there forms, are there things happening that you, when I pick up a translated book, I often feel there's a wider range of possibility that could await me, as opposed to maybe like a major press, you know, American book from this year. That might be like my own misconception, but I do feel there's an openness of possibility. And I wonder if you agree in what you make of that, that notion that there is a greater capaciousness in translated literature.
I mean, I don't know if I can generalize about all of translated literature, you know? I do think for me, as somebody who's steeped mostly, at least, you know, professionally the last couple of years in Anglophone novels, I felt in a lot of the books that really moved me and excited me, one, a lack of some of the self-consciousness that I feel pervades some American fiction, you know? You can feel almost not apologetic, but it's unsure. What is this for? Who's reading me? What is happening? I shouldn't be doing anything else. I don't know. I mean, I'm generalizing grossly, but sometimes I feel this. And then it was wonderful to read some of these, like, you know, this Korean novel, The Whale. That's just this
great book.
Did you read it?
Yeah, it's great.
It's wild.
Completely nuts.
Just batshit crazy, ambitious, spiraling. What's happening? It was just amazing to read. There's another really, I mean, I can give examples after examples of things that I specifically felt and was reminded of and felt energized by in specific books. Now, whether or not those amount to like larger trends or something that, you know, non-Anglophone writers possess that we don't know, not necessarily. I think we were also getting just incredibly incredibly beautiful and rich examples of the stuff. But yeah, I mean, I think that it does feel like a breaking out when you do leave some of the things that keep us confined, and some of that's in terms of the largeness of Whale, but some of it is also the smallness. One of the books that made it to our short list is this book. I don't know if it's even like 100 pages long. It's called Boulder, and it's just like this little ice pick of a book, and and is itself, without any editorializing, without any sort of larger claims for what it is, but it is, it's perfect. So yeah, I mean, I think it's something that, you know, I thought that I would lament having like more than 100 books to read. And I just felt when I came to the end of it, you know, just so excited to keep going.
So I'm going to actually jump into audience questions and then jump back to me for a minute, because we apparently have a very highly rated audience question about the International Booker Prize process I'm going to read. I don't know who asked this because I don't have the names. So whoever you are, great question. Quote, if I was wondering if during the few months that you had to spend reading over 100 books for the prize, if you felt like you had to grapple in a new way with how the author's words and the translator's words are the warp and the woof of the tapestry you were looking at. How do you talk about those two interwoven components in a way that feels helpful and exciting and grounded in things you could be certain of?
Constantly. And we love it. We love it. You know, this is the thing where it comes back and it's sort of forcing us, at least when we talked about it, that brings us back to the fundamentals of what's happening, the fundamentals of story, the fundamentals of language, the fundamentals of also what we can understand, right? And so there were books that we talked about that were wonderful, but we worried, like, that awkwardness, is that in the original? Is that in the translation? How do you know? Well, you read, you discuss, you find examples, you know, you try to think together. But yeah, no, all of those questions are, again, I think some of the pleasures of thinking in translation at all, that it brings you right back so close to language and so close to choice and so close to, what does my editor say? Narration is titration, right? So how slowly, how is a story being told? How is it being disclosed to you? What's being held back? All of this stuff it's the business of criticism, right? Like, you're lucky if you can do it with a bunch of judges, but sometimes, Adam, if you and I are reviewing books, we're trying to do it by ourselves on the page, you know, to sort of have that conversation.
And there are differences I've found between reading as a judge and reading as a critic. There are different, I don't know if that's for you, but I think about slightly different things, maybe because it's a committee, but maybe also just what makes a book great is sometimes different from deeply loving it, at least in my case. And those are things I wrestle with as a judge as opposed to a critic.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that, I mean, I haven't judged many things before, but I think there are more conversations that one has internally and with everybody else about what it means to be the best, to be chosen, to stand for something. Whereas I think the kinds of criticism I'm interested in aren't really concerned with those questions,
No.
You know, in a big way. So I think that some of that, and also about the moment, right? Like, you anoint a book for the moment. What does that mean? So all of that, is much more present. But at the same time, you know, it's still that feeling that everyone has to stay close to, of a very, very solitary private act, which is what's happening just between you and the book. That's all that matters. After a while, everything just sort of should ebb and sort of vanish.
I was very interested on that point to read your sort of, you wrote a review of the New York Times Book Review for the New York Times a few years ago, and you were talking about how the first person plural was a sort of dominant form for a critic to take, at least in that newspaper for quite a while. And I think of that in comparison to your own first person voice in your reviews, which is very much your own, is my feeling of it. And so I do wonder about if you could talk a bit about your usage of first person. I know many critics are sort of reluctant to break into first person at first. It goes against maybe the Publisher's Weekly style reviews a lot of us start doing. And what is like your voice on the page when you write? And we'll take audience questions in a minute.
Do any of us know what we sound like?
No,
God
well,
forbid.
after I'll watch this video back and regret what I said.
I won't. But yeah, I think that benign, coercive we, right? And we all use it. And it's an interesting thing to grapple with, what it's assuming, what it's trying to make you think it's an interesting thing to pluck apart. And it's an interesting thing, I think, for reviews to, shake up and question. In terms of using the I, I am not somebody who relishes necessarily writing about myself. I don't find myself very interesting in this way. I think what I'm looking at is very interesting. And I think that if there's a point of interest, I would like it to be my sensibility and the way that we're looking at it together, So as a character in it, not my favorite thing, although it happens, it's definitely there, but I prefer to think of it in a arch kind of elliptical way instead of doing like a big soft shoe, That's just not my mode. But yeah, it's interesting because when I teach, I find that my students more and more insist upon an I, they find that is the way to announce who you are, your perspective, where you're coming from. It sets up the occasion for the piece. It does all this complicated work that for me and I tussle with them about this. I don't know if one needs to be quite so defensive all the time. If one necessarily needs to come and lay all of this out. And especially I think for those of us, I mean, there's some critics I think who do go to criticism because they love their voice. And then there's some critics I think who go to criticism because they want to drown. And I think I want to drown. Like I want to be in those books. And I'll come up for air and show you what I'm seeing. But essentially to merge and to be in that is just the pleasure of it, I think.
So speaking of drowning, you had this quote in your beautiful review of Laurie Moore recently.
Speaking of drowning, what is
because let us be a little vulgar, let us stand on the shore and wave at you, Laurie Moore.
Yeah.
I thought that was a rebuttal to Laurie Moore. It's kind of
Laurie Moore is so funny because she just wants to get away from the critics, and I just love the image. So the quote, she quotes this jazz musician, Ben Sidran, who says, I don't remember the exact thing. He's like, he was like, critics can't swim, can't float, stand on shore and wave the boat. And I just loved it.
Let us do it.
Let's just wave at the boat. It's nice to see you, Laurie Moore.
I was excited to use speaking of drowning. It will never happen again. It will never happen again. So I had to take my moment when I thought, but I was wondering, in terms of that quote also, who are the writers for you who you're standing on the shore and yelling at all the time? Like, who are you still fascinated by, thinking about, unwinding in your mind?
Oh God.
And that's a tough question. I know that's a hard question.
Yeah, who am I not? I feel again, I keep them close by, I think that I don't know if I'm talking to them or waving at them necessarily, but they're always, I think that people like Muriel Spark, Amos's criticism, some of Naipaul for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think I read just the right amount of Dickens when I was small, that it's there. Oh, a lot of these people are, it's yeah. So I mean, it's and a bunch of critics. I don't know. This feels somehow so revealing, doesn't it? To talk about. Yeah.
Yes, it's a very intimate question.
These are my nighttime activities. I can't divulge.
Okay, we'll let you keep some secrets, but maybe the audience will get some out of you, because I will ask a few questions now.
Okay.
Apologies if I am rephrasing any questions on the fly. Okay, this question has a high rating from our audience chat.
Are they rating each other's questions?
Apparently, I'm finding this out as you are.
I don't want to know.
I don't want to know. I don't want to look. Since this is a discussion titled "A Vocabulary of Pleasure," could you talk about how you've noticed writers writing about pleasure and how that's changed over time? Anything about our particular era or about different cultures talking about pleasure?
I mean, the easiest way, I think, to answer this maybe is to talk about, I mean, when it comes to love, when it comes to just love, sex, erotic happiness is something that I don't think American writers know what to do. There are very few, and we always say the same people are writing well about sex. It's always like Garth Greenwell writes very well about sex.
He does.
He does. But it was interesting when I found myself reading in Catalan and reading all these other books, and just sort of to say, there's still so much to say about love, and there's so much to say about not just like love and sex and objection, but love and sex and eros and finding, and where it blurs into other forms of life. I was so surprised and happy to see. And maybe that also goes to that point about the self-consciousness, right? It's a very difficult kind of writing to do if you're feeling anxious and if you feel like the job of the writer is to be clever. And I think that American writers really want to be clever sometimes. And that is it's a hard position to operate from, where so much of that kind of writing requires dawdling and being vulnerable and being all kinds of this stuff, I think that's the one thing, that kind of pleasure. Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, it's yeah, I think I mean, the other form is interesting, that I don't know if this ties into pleasure, but there is so much, especially in Europe right now, thinking about national identity, and thinking about what it means to be a European. That it has nothing to do with pleasure. In fact, it's the opposite of pleasure. But it is something that, as I was reading book after book, that was sort of one kind of fable of nationhood after another, I was like, this is something that, I think this point has been made in all kinds of different ways through time, but, yeah, to sort of like have great novels on national identity, something that we don't do anymore. Maybe that's a good thing. I don't know if I could read anymore, but I did notice, that was a big compelling thing.
What about, and this is a follow-up for me, you write so well about the pleasure you take in reading, and I think you avoid what you have described as assault by adjective, which some critics kind of turn to. How does one, and maybe this is almost a question about ekphrasis, but like you seem to write very beautifully about the books you love, and so what is your process of sort of transferring that love to a reader and writing with love about a work of art?
I think that I don't think about translating it for the reader. I think really just about trying to understand how I've thought about it and been moved by it. And then I think Martin Amis has a nice phrase. He's like, well, you critics, you can't just sidle up to a piece of art and purr. One must say something, so, and then trying to sort of dig in to say, but where does that pleasure come from? What is being satisfied? What is happening in that scene? Why is that character so alluring or so intriguing, right? So then to sort of use the pleasure or use the revulsion as the opening to a certain kind of thought and as a certain kind of argument, I think that's the way that I think I would proceed.
Another audience question. Would you comment on the use of, quote, our, as in our leading novelist, one of our best, and so on? Who is this we who owns this judgment? That was another highly rated one.
Can I just let that stand? I agree. Yeah, I don't know who that we is. That's me.
I think I read it like a.
I liked also like the kind of like light John Lovett's impression that was happening there. Who is that we?
Yeah, I don't know. I heard myself doing it.
It was good. I liked it.
Okay, so we just agree. We agree with your comment. We shouldn't do that. Okay, another question. There is often focus on loss through translation. What are your thoughts on there being gain? Is this harder to pick up on? Does it happen less?
What is gained in translation?
Yes.
I mean, this is a better question, I think, to ask for writers, and the writers that I've spoken to who've been translated have sometimes spoken about finding new nuances in their own work based on a different kind of lexical choice or syntactical, change here or there. But no, I think the obvious gain is more readers, but beyond that specifically, I can imagine that much is gained, but I can also imagine being translated to be very eerie, I don't know. This is for the next interview in your series, Adam.
Okay, I'll copy paste it. Another question, and this I think loops back all the way to the beginning of our conversation when we were talking about the controlled substance of books in your home, and then we kind of jumped to your current work as a critic. A question I would love to know a bit more about your journey as a critic and how it began and how it influenced your own work.
How did that begin? I think it began pretty prosaically, I think when I thought about wanting something to do with writing, I thought, well, one must write a novel. And it was just the most miserable experience. Like the effort to get this character across the room, I wanted to die, and everything else about writing, about thinking about work, about thinking about who this writer is, what has she chosen to do? Why is this book moving this way? Why is it raking up people's feelings and projections in this other way? All of that, I just found very, very exciting. And in terms of it becoming work, it's very prosaic. I went to an MFA program and I needed a job. And I got jobs editing, and I just and I had a friend who came to my desk one day and was sort of very censorious. And he's like, what are you doing with your mind? You're doing nothing with your mind. Review some books, do something. And then I just started, and it just became just addictive. It just became, I think, a way of just thinking out loud that I was already doing, so it just sort of happened very naturally. And a lot of the places, it should go mention that a lot of the places that where I think a bunch of us got our start have gone, the places that I think a critic could reasonably rise outside of the academy, right? We're talking about a whole different kind of vanishing breed of people, I think, that came up in newspapers and magazines. It's very hard to do that now. It was hard then, but it was not this hard. No, it was amazing. I was taught by my editors, and I think the best thing was to sort of write for a whole bunch of different places, to learn how to throw your voice a little bit, to not be precious, to learn different house styles. So it was a great, great, great education.
And someone said in the chat, I think the translator Jeff Zuckerman, also for the money. You got into criticism for the money.
Can you imagine saying that now? Even then it wasn't much, but it was still like, anyway, yeah.
I'm going to do a boldness and combine two different audience questions into one 3-part question. So Here are the 3 parts. I would love if Parul could answer how she decides what books to review, and if she has a different approach to reviewing nonfiction versus fiction. And then the 3rd part, do you ever read for pleasure is that possible without thinking about how you critique what you're reading? So a bunch of reading practice questions.
Okay, last one is very easy. So let's start with that. Do I read for pleasure? Sure, but I think that, I still argue back, I still disagree. I still mark up margins. Like it's still, it's not a holiday in that particular way, but I also just love arguing. So it's all fair. So in terms of choosing what to do, at the times that was very easy. There was a space that had to be filled once a week. And so you look and you see, you have to find something. Sometimes it's easy. Sometimes it's like, well, I don't know if this is the right book to review, but I can make something interesting around it. I can write something that might be able to run. At the New Yorker, there's a lot more freedom, So I think now I pick books when I review books specifically, if it's a writer that deeply interests me, or the project is very interesting, or if there's something symptomatic, right? Is there something about this book that can be looked at and opened up, and we can talk a little bit more about other things that we are seeing happening in books, Jenny Odell's book, which I reviewed on Time, was a book like that, a book that I wasn't necessarily so interested in. It was suggested to me, and reading it, I was like, okay, this book is doing a lot of things that I enjoy and I'm very wary of in contemporary nonfiction, right? So it can become an occasion to talk about that. In terms of reading fiction and nonfiction differently and reviewing them differently, I suppose I must do it differently. It doesn't feel different in my mind or my body. I think that in nonfiction, just to put it very plainly, like there's probably a little bit more, I will do more summary. Generally in novels, I hate summarizing. I don't care. I want the plot to be 2 sentences. I hate those reviews that are going to lead us ceremoniously chapter by chapter, right? But in nonfiction, I think I will do a little bit more of that, just give a little bit more of that context. So I think that's how I do it differently. There's a little bit more gloss in the fiction. The fiction, I want to get the plot summarized as quickly as possible and then move on to almost anything else.
What I also noticed from reading a review is, this is me talking, is like you can read your review before reading a book and not be like, not just spoiled, but I feel like the plot is still mine when I read a book. And so
Yeah.
often your reviews are like introducing me to a book and an argument that I might have as I'm reading it. And sometimes I do find critics will go beat by beat through a novel to the point that you almost think, I don't know if I need to read this.
Yeah. 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 No, thank you. I'm glad. I think that just comes out of like my own abiding sense of and my own sort of just incredible sense of boredom, you know, like if I'm going to get drowsy reading you laying out the plot, there's no way I'm going to put anybody through that. So
I love that. So we have many questions left, so I'm not going to get to all of them. I'm just taking them kind of as I see them. Cutting down a longer question. Do you conceive of the work you do as a critic or teacher as disentangled vocations? We were talking earlier about like pedagogical criticism, and or do you think they're kind of enmeshed, your work as a teacher versus your work as a critic?
they feel very separate. They feel very, very separate. And I think that in part, what I do as a teacher and what's very important to me is to just lead with doubt and lead with, I am the least important person here. I always tell them this, you know, and it's really just to sort of create, or, you know, try very hard to create occasions for them to speak to each other and listen to each other. So it's really, I really don't want to be a overbearing personality in that space. I don't want people to want my approval. I don't want people to really, and every now and again I'll pop up and say something. It's not that I'm, but I really, for me, it's really, really about creating that kind of space and that energy, you know. But you know, when I'm writing criticism, you're mine. So, so that's.
And maybe just time for one more from the audience, because I know we have a hard out. On Wayne Kustenbaum, yes. Please talk more about the importance of touch and the tactile in criticism. I'm thinking of the wonderful new book by David Russell, Tact.
Yes. I mean, I also just want to let that stand on Wayne Kustenbaum. Yes. Wayne Kustenbaum. Well, I think that Wayne's writing and Bart's writing for me, I think, wind around this idea of language as a skin, you know, and that when you read, it's something that you are touching, things snag you, things surprise you, things you slip over, you know, so that reading itself, right? Like the word text comes from textile, right? It comes from cloth, it comes from something made. So I think that that's a big pleasure in thinking about their work, but also in their work itself, which is just soft and prickly and plushy and gooey, and you're constantly, you know, it's sensorium muddling, you know, you do feel all of you is being brought to the text. And it's been, you cannot copy these two writers. One can only be inspired by it and relish reading them, and then hope that some of it will seep into your own awareness and that you can create some kind of occasion for that delight.
Well, we titled this Pleasure on Delight. So I think that's a perfect place to end our conversation today. Thank you so much. This flew by and was so fun.
Thank you for all the questions, and thank you again for all the work you do.
And thank you, Adam, too, for hosting, and to everybody who showed up to listen to Parul. And Adam, a reminder that you can all visit Words Without Borders, where we publish daily at wordswithoutborders.org. And the best way, obviously, to stay on top of everything we're doing is via the newsletter. We'll send you an email in the coming days with the link to the recording of this excellent conversation. Thanks for coming out, everybody. Hope you had a pleasant time. Take care.
Bye.